CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to yet another episode with me, Beginkosi Moyo, on Conversations on African Philanthropy. Today I'm joined by Siphosami Malunga, the outgoing director of OSISA, who has actually taken on a new role on the Africa version of the new merged organization, the Open Society Foundation Africa. Sipho has a long history in human rights as a legal scholar, a lawyer, a practitioner, who has worked in different regions of the world. Sipho, welcome.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've tried to find a perfect time for us to have this conversation, and I think today is actually one of those moments where it just lends itself to a perfect conversation. You have just given what we called a keynote, and you disputed it, and you didn't want it to be called a keynote. But we are gathering here today looking at barriers to civil society in Africa, especially when it comes to civil society performing its functions in the different contexts. And your work has really been involved in the last 10 years, but even more when you're with the other institutions, working around democratic, building democracy, democratic cultures across the continent and beyond. And you have just provoked the audience. Maybe we can start there and just, reflect on a few issues that you gave to the audience.
Yes. Thank you so much, Peggy. It's really a pleasure to be on your program, and congratulations on the journey that CAPSI has taken. It seems not too long ago that CAPSI was started, but the amount of progress you've made is really testament, I think, to your contribution and that of your own comrades and colleagues. So you had asked me to come and talk about, give a keynote, which I disputed. I preferred to provoke the thoughts of the audience and the debate around some of the conceptual definitions of some of the issues. What is civil society, for example? If we say civil society space is shrinking, perhaps we need to start by saying, what is civil society? Who is civil society? What do we mean? If we say the space is shrinking from what? It's been shrinking for the past 15 years. That has been the narrative.
Yeah.
And you remember when I started, I said, if it's been shrinking for 15 years, why is it not yet disappeared?
Yeah.
Because it's been shrinking continuously. So I asked that question as well. And then I asked, is it really shrinking? That was another question. If we're saying democracy is reversing and regressing, from what? What's our starting point? What's our standpoint? Were we ever democratic as a continent? At what point can we say we're at our highest level of democracy? So it's provoking us to ask those questions, to interrogate some of these concepts that we throw around, so that at least maybe we can begin to more seriously, meaningfully find answers.
Yeah. So maybe we can start where we are today in your current position within the global network of the Open Society Foundations, but the Africa, the new outfit that has been created out of the existing foundations that were in the continent. In your new position as the Director of Programs, I think it would be important for us to reflect where we are. What is the state of civil society today, and what is the state of democracy from the perspective of Open Society Foundations Africa?
Yes, thank you so much. So I, as you rightly pointed out, I've assumed a new role in Open Society Africa, leading the programs work continentally, and at least from an Open Society perspective, the perception we have is that given what seemed to be progress, and I have to be very clear here, what seemed to be progress in democratization in the continent So the abandonment of one-party states in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, the abandonment of wholesale abandonment of one-party states continentally, the abandonment of military regimes, especially in West Africa, the cessation of conflict, especially intrastate conflict or internal conflict, civil wars. What we have been seeing progressively in the past 5 to 10 years is a stalling of that progress. That's how I would characterize the reversal of democracy. Not so much that we were once, paragons of democracy or virtue of democracy globally. We were never. And I said this in the meeting, that we must accept where we're coming from. If we're looking at a prism of 30, 40, 50 years, Africa never inherited democracy from colonial regimes. They inherited oppression, racism, and exploitation. And of course, our leaders didn't do any better, because they, in place of racism, oppression, and exploitation, what they put in place was one-party state oppression and of course exploitation. This is now black on black. So the post-colony was native colonialism, and the people of Africa are fighting for democracy, and they're in the process of curating what they want as democracy, and that's perfect. It has had some starts and stops. And the abandonment of one-party states was an important epoch. But of course, we all know that what then happened is that it was really a reincarnation of the one-party states, dominant political parties, dominant electoral parties who never intended for competition to be really and genuinely fair. So the one-party state became the only party, or it made sure that the opposition parties never won. The generals took off their uniforms and put on suits. So we know that was the nature of what was deemed as progress and democratization in the continent. But the struggle for genuine democratization has never ended, and it continues.
Yeah. And so, I mean, obviously, the Open Society Foundations and the founder, George Soros, have always been on this journey around opening closed societies. And closed societies is a concept that changes over time. So at one moment, it was maybe political spaces, it went on to the economic spaces, and potentially we could be talking about closed society in the area of digital world and et cetera, and et cetera. What is the role of a foundation like yours in addressing these very challenges that you have actually articulated? And what has been the journey so far? I mean, you've been at the helm of OSISA for more than at least 10 years, and now on this new role.
Yes.
And Open Society globally has also been on this journey for years and years. So maybe we could, spotlight a few of the experiences and reflections from Open Society Foundations.
Thank you, Biggie. That's a great question. And one of the most fascinating, I think, attributes of at least George Soros is that he's always believed in the fallibility of truth, that there's no one truth as a starting point. But if there's no one truth, there has to be space for all truths to be presented and contested and debated. And that's at the heart of what an open society is about. That ideas, there's no one idea, there's no one direction, there's no one narrative of anything. So if we talk about political liberalism, open society from a perspective of political liberalism, which is plurality in the democratic and open political space, the ability to contest political power, the ability to express views, to assemble, to organize, that's one level. But even that has its limitations. So there's no perfection even in that system, as we've seen, because the most perverse element of it is populism, right? It's populism in majoritarian populism or majoritarian systems. But the reality is that democracy is not so much about protecting the majority, but it's also about protecting the minority. That's one level. The second level is, of course, open society is also about openness in the markets, in the economy, allowing opportunity for everybody. But the perverse aspect of it is capitalism, is rogue capitalism. it's transnational capitalism, it's imperial capitalism. It is that the competition can be stifled by those that already have an advantage in the space, and that they can co-opt all the others, and they can control huge economies, they can control the politics as well. And we begin to see the perverse coalitions between the business and the economic and the political elites and the interests, and how that then perverts both democracy and the economic liberalism that might ideally, at what some point was touted. And we begin to question, which we have always in Africa, neoliberalism and the perverse nature of neoliberalism and its impact on Africa as an instrument of the post-imperial colony. So, yeah, I think for us, the idea of open society is one in which everyone in that society is free to engage, to speak, to participate, to question, and to contest ideas, to contest power, to contest spaces, opportunities. It is very, very important. And of course, if you are going to engage in any space, you start with those that are already on the margins of participation. There's little point in going to those that are already at the front. If you're opening up, if you're trying to open up a society, you go to those who are outside to try to get them inside. And once they're inside, to try to get them, to strengthen their own agency to engage as equals in that particular space. Thank you.
So in a way, that's what I think we could say has been the support given by the network of foundations globally, but also in Africa. Are there any specific, I would say, specific successes that maybe over the last 10 or even more years we could say in Africa, for example, or Southern Africa for that matter? These are the 3 or 4 key successes that we have supported as open society foundations in these networks.
Oh yeah, many, so many. So if one looks at open society from the spectrum, from political to economic and social justice, from political rights, opportunity to economic and social justice, there's quite a lot of what I think as OSISA at least, but as OSF in general in the continent. But I'll talk a little bit about OSISA. A lot of fascinating initiatives that have yielded some positive outcomes over time. So I'll tell you one most interesting one. You'll remember that a couple of years ago we had COVID. We can't forget that.
Yeah.
And one of the things that, one of the most innovative things that happened with COVID in our region was the introduction of basic income grants. And Namibia was one of the champions of that. And I think it was 700 Namibian dollars they gave to everybody. And South Africa then introduced one as well. I think it was 300 or 400.
Yeah.
But of course, South Africa already had an income grant as well. And then, of course, the Americans introduced it. The Canadians introduced it as well. And many countries, because they realized that with industry shutting down, with unemployment, people needed support.
Yeah.
One of the fascinating things is that in around 2010, Open Society advocated for a SADC basic income grant. You may remember this at the time, Peggy. And we went around, and Namibians were very interested in it. And they even, I think, tried to pilot it. It was fascinating that 10 years later, when COVID hit, there we were, everybody adopting a basic income grant as soon as they could. But this had been something that we had championed 10 years earlier. That's just one example.
Yeah.
The second is this: at a political level, you will know that a country like Lesotho, for example, has been plagued for decades with turbulence and crisis, political crisis. Really a governance crisis, political crisis, since independence, with the same actors from independence, regurgitating themselves, almost like a musical chairs. From the 60s, the same people just rotating, and multiplicity of parties for a small population of just over 1 million. And one of the things that we recognized in Lesotho, and then of course conflict and violence, very violent society, unlike many countries in the continent where ethnicity is a key feature of political contestation. The fascinating thing about Lesotho is that it's only one ethnic group, but the contestation is so violent and so rabid and so complex. One of the fascinating things we did in Lesotho is that for some years, even during the time when the time of the turbulence of the coalition, the difficult coalition governments, was that we supported the revitalization of civil society, especially young people who felt that they wanted to take their country back from these old madalas who were holding the country hostage, literally. And one of the things we did was supported an initiative called the Lesotho We Want, which was an inclusive program of mobilization by a whole range of civic actors, civil society actors, young students, women's groups, civil society organizations working on the economy, working on accountability and corruption, the church, and so on. And the fascinating thing is that when the reforms agenda started in Lesotho, these groups were quite clear in engaging. So the civic society component of participation, because remember I said there was a stranglehold on the politics by these old madalas in the political space. So all that engagement by civil society culminated in a fascinating push for political transformation in the country, which really was what we saw with Matekane winning an outright majority, dispensing of the need for coalitions, for negotiations, and so on. Of course, Matekane was in some ways, part of the old political establishment in some way, but he was younger, he was fresh, and he drew a lot on the young people. And this new reinvigorated civil society and the civic space. So that's one thing. We're not saying we put Matekane there, but we're saying that we contributed to revitalizing the civic space, which then, of course, led to a completely different political outcome. There's others. I don't know if you want me to keep going, but I'll stop.
I mean,
there.
we could refer to them as we go on. So, I mean, some people argued today that philanthropy and your foundation is part of the broader philanthropic ecosystem, that philanthropy is at a crossroad or philanthropy is at an inflection point. And you guys have just gone through an elaborate makeover of some sort. And I want us to see if we could just pick one or two lessons out of that process, because I think it has really been something that all institutions that you were supporting and onlookers have really paid a keen interest to see what the outcome would look like. And obviously institutions have to revive themselves time and time again, and you guys have just done that. What are your reflections on the journey that you have just traveled with the entire foundations in Africa and globally, so to speak?
That's a great question. So Peggy, the cliche is that the only constant is change. The only thing that doesn't change is change. So the Open Society Foundation has gone through a fascinating journey. When George Soros started his philanthropic work, he actually started in South Africa. You know better.
70s,
I mean, you are really our professor in philanthropy, so you know better. You've told me many of the stories that I don't know actually about George Soros' philanthropy, so I can't tell you anything that you don't know. But the point is that, like everything else, philanthropy needs to be fit for purpose. It needs to adapt to context, to change, and at some point in time, the Open Society Foundation had a certain character, a certain flavor, a certain approach, and it grew. Because we've just consolidated the different regional foundations into one Africa entity. I've been also talking about the legacy. We've been trying to preserve the legacy. What's the legacy of OSISA in this region? We've been talking about that. And you'll be very surprised to know that it started with about 5 staff, a budget of maybe about 5 million.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it grew very rapidly. It was picking up things as they were happening. And at the time, one of the greatest innovations of it was that it could just take on things. So if there was a crisis, so you'd build a new program.
Yeah.
So the growth was unrestricted and unhindered. It would. So you come across a challenge faced by indigenous groups in the region. You just start an indigenous rights program, and then you realize that there's challenges with economic paradigms. The orthodoxy of neoliberalism needs to be challenged. Then you have an economic justice program.
Yeah.
And then you realize that, there's health challenges. Our countries are struggling, to deliver health services, and there's no rights orientation to the provision of health services. Health are not considered as rights. Then you have a health program. Then you realize education is a challenge. Then you have an education program. So it almost grew organically. And at some point in time, at different points in time, there were efforts to reorganize it, because for you to be efficient, effective, and impactful, you really need to direct. So there were different points in time. I was part of some of those changes where we sought to reorganize the work, reorganize ourselves. And then, of course, as you grow, if you grow without any restriction, sometimes there's a skewed balance between what you need to deliver and what you're actually delivering outside. So there have been efforts along the way to try and correct some of these imbalances, to make sure that at least more support and more resources go to the mission of the organization other than the people that are delivering the mission. And in some instances, the space, very constrained, might not have the people out there who are working on the issues, or the people are in far-flung places. Like if you're talking about indigenous rights groups, they are in the middle of the desert.
Yeah.
They're in remote places. The literacy levels are zero. So you have to have a more unique way of engaging. How do you engage with indigenous groups in Etosha National Park in Namibia, or in Kgalagadi in Botswana, or the pygmies in Congo? These are people that you may not necessarily reach. So what are the adaptations that you use? Do you use groups that get there? Do you use... So obviously we've had to do constantly that introspection. And we had more recently in the past couple of years to do another huge introspection of the fitness for purpose for the contemporary times and challenges that open society faces now. And of course, this was the right time to do it.
Yeah.
Because one, we were in the middle of COVID, and COVID shifted everything, as you know. COVID shifted the way we understand and perceive democracy. COVID shifted the way we understand the economy, technology. So the post-COVID period was a critical point. It's actually a critical point for the whole world to reflect. There's many other things. Over the past 10, 15 years, we've seen what we talked about earlier when we started, the trends towards, challenges to democratic resilience, or a slowing down of the pace of democratization, or some setbacks in many instances, where we begin to see people wanting third terms. We begin to see the resurgence of coups. There's so many coups now in West Africa.
Yeah.
The resurgence of conflicts, devastating conflicts, killing hundreds of thousands of people in the Sahel, in Nigeria, in Ethiopia, in the Eastern Congo, in Mozambique. These are things we didn't see in the 90s. In the 90s, we had robust continental systems that could go in and stop conflict. Yet right there, the AU watched as Ethiopia disintegrated, in Tigray, and they couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
And then we were watching when Sudan is disintegrating. This was not the case during the times of the Obasanjos and the Mbekis, the new AU, the NEPADs. There was a more serious and committed effort to try to resolve continental problems. Yeah. And we've seen a reversal of this positive trend, which means that we need to rethink our strategy. We need to rethink our approach, but that also means we need to rethink ourselves. Are we fit for purpose?
Yeah.
Is the way we are organized still the best way to respond to contemporary challenges in the world, not just in the continent? We also have to understand that the problem for Africa is not just the problem within African countries, it's the problem of Africa's place in the world, and the way in which Africa has continuously been exploited, and the way in which the colonial paradigm has transformed into other things in the global financial architecture, in the global governance architecture. In every which way, the new geopolitical fights and the fight for the heart and the soul of African minerals, the green minerals, and the new imperial Berlin. The scramble for Africa is back. And how do we then learn from the past? And what is the place of open society in that game, where we want a really genuinely open world, not just an open Africa, where Africa is also a genuine actor, equitable, actor in that space. So those are some of the things that motivated some of the changes, Peggy, and we are really excited about some of these changes that have come about, because we have now a new Pan-African strategy, which is focused, which is at scale, which is integrated, so that you're not trying to do everything everywhere, but you're making tough choices about things that need to be done and where and how, and you're putting everything into it.
So I mean, issues of right sizing, restructuring, recalibration have got advantages, some of which we have talked about. But I was involved in one myself a couple of years back when I took over one institution, the trust. And there are challenges also that come with that. So in seeking effectiveness in the process of that, there's a lot of cleaning up, there's a lot of pain, and a lot of challenges. Were there some that you might want to just identify and say, in us getting to where we are, we had to confront these 2 or 3 main challenges?
Oh yes, absolutely. Any change is painful. Really, because people are comfortable with the status quo. Even if the status quo is not perfect, people have found a way to coexist with it. And they are comfortable, they have ways to navigate. So if you put people outside the comfort zone, it's painful and uncomfortable. And that's been my experience of the different changes that we have seen throughout, and by no means less this one. So yes, absolutely. So one of the changes was that in trying to rebalance the ratio of resources, making sure that you are still responsive to the plethora of challenges. I mean, you remember that during COVID, none of us expected COVID. We didn't know there would be COVID, so nobody had budgeted for COVID. So, for example, just during COVID, it meant that we had to completely redirect all the resources
towards
COVID.
So
suddenly there's COVID, and there's no money you've got set aside for COVID. So you need to really think that the only challenge is COVID right now. So you need to repurpose the money you have. It's almost the same, even at a family level. You have something happen, you have a death, an illness. You're not going to go on that holiday. You're not going to go on the holiday because you have to direct the resources to something else. So when COVID happened, it meant that there had to be some repurposing, there had to be some rethinking. But then, of course, the post-COVID meant that you have to now rethink a whole lot of things. It also meant that some tough choices about also doing work differently, doing things differently. We learned during COVID that you didn't need to go to the office to get work done, even though that came with its own constraints. But we also learned that there are ways in which you can do more with less. There are ways in which you can reduce, you can be more efficient. Remember, I told you about the growth trajectory of OSF in general, including OSISA, that we grew and grew and grew and grew. Then you have to then start to think about what really does it take to deliver X. Does it take 4 people to deliver something, or does it take 1? Can it be done with 1? Are there other cheaper and smarter ways to deliver this? If you haven't thought about it, then you're not going to do it. But if you really sit down and try to think, how do we now maximize? How do we build economies of scale? How do we get more for less? And so all these important things. So there are many painful points. I mean, restructuring sometimes comes with loss of jobs. It comes with change of jobs, change of roles, change of titles.
Yeah.
It comes with shifting priorities, a sense sometimes to some of our partners that you're abandoning us.
Yeah.
But the reality is that the world might have changed in a way that might mean that you need to refocus
And reassess.
And it doesn't mean that you're abandoning, but it might also mean that your partners need to also reassess.
Yeah.
You might want to help them reassess and rethink that, hey, you know what, the world you can't operate now as if we are still in 2018. The world has changed.
Yeah.
We can't operate now as if the world doesn't have this global food crisis and energy crisis and all these crises out of Ukraine. Yes, someone might say, well, why does Ukraine affect us? It shouldn't, but it does.
It does, yeah.
And therefore, what does it mean? How do we then make those adjustments?
Yeah. So as we prepare to land, I think one of the things that I like to do with my guests is to end by getting to know them better. So, people would be seeing you leading all these institutions, but there's a SIPO. So, looking at your formal resume, one sees that you have had a beautiful career, if one can characterize it that way, starting early on practicing law in Zimbabwe, and then moving on to international shows, spent a lot of time in Kosovo, among others, ended up at the helm of some of the programs at UNDP. I remember a couple of years back when you were leading the team here in South Africa before you went to New York. So maybe we could talk a bit about where did it all start for SIPO, and how do you end up in all these spaces, the career trajectory. It's fascinating that we are here in philanthropy, but you actually started very much as a legal practitioner, and went on to really work on international issues, international law. So I want us to connect that. So
yes,
let's try and do that. By also getting to know SIPO, the person.
No, thank you so much, Peggy. Where did it start?
Yeah.
I maybe let me tell you about my very first memory. My very first memory as a little boy. That perhaps relates to where I am now. Peggy, it's difficult for me to have a conversation that doesn't reference my own personal history and childhood.
Yeah.
So I must have been maybe 5 years old. I don't know at what point people can remember things first, where the memory sets in. And I had gone to visit my father in jail. My father was a political prisoner. He spent, I think, a long period of time, over a decade in jail, maybe up to 15, in and out of jail during the Rhodesian period. He was a freedom fighter in Zimbabwe, and we'd gone to visit him with my mother. And my mother we could only visit him once every 6 months or so, because she could only take a certain number of children. Obviously, I went to visit him more when I was on her back, when I was a little kid, but I had no memory of that. And then, of course, at the time, there was 5 of us. My mother had 5 children at the time, so she had to juggle. She couldn't take all the 5 at any given point. And we would go and visit him, and he would be, one time, I don't know if it was Wawa or Konmara in Gweru. So we'd get on the train, and the train used to leave at night, and it would arrive in Gweru in almost early morning, and then we'd get off the train, and then we'd wait until they opened the prison at 10 or so. So we'd all go and wait and sit outside the gate, and then they would open the prison, then we'd go inside, and then we'd go in, then they would be sitting and talking, and my father would be wearing khakis, these khakis, the prison khakis. And my first memory was this man, because remember when I was born, my father was actually in prison.
Yeah.
And he was only released when I was about 9 years old. And before that, I was just visiting him in prison as a kid. I only knew my father in this prison in Cape.
He lives in prison.
And I remember one of my first memories is that we'd gone there. So my mother would take food and mazoe, this mazoe bottle, and for him, and then you put it all on the. Then so you sit there as a family, you get to sit and talk to him. So he'd be sitting there. The fascinating thing was how at ease the man was. The man was not bothered.
Yeah.
He was just so calm. It was almost like he's sitting in his living room. It was almost like he's sitting in his living room. And my mother, of course, would be there, and you'd be asking us, "Oh, how's school? And this is the memory I have, I guess, which relates to my current, the truth to power.
Yeah.
The truth to power trajectory is that when the time, so then they would ring the bell, they would signal that the time is about to end, the visiting hours. And then, so my father would act like he didn't even hear it.
Yeah.
And then they would ring it again, and then they'll say visiting time is up. I can tell you, baby, every time that happened, he would refuse for the visit. He would just completely tell those prison officers off. No, just leave me alone. I'm still here. Don't you see? I'm still with my family. Don't you see this? And he would. So then there would be. And then my mother, of course, would be like, no, leave. It's okay. We're packing. So what are you doing? So you now start arguing with my mother. Stop packing. What are you doing? We're still having the visiting hour. It was a very fascinating thing. This was this fascinating ritual. That, of course, this is man talking to these white people as if, to the white prison guard, as if he's talking to an equal.
Yeah.
Of course, he's a prisoner.
Yeah.
So I never understood him to be a prisoner in his interaction with those people that I saw. And I loved how he did it, because of course we were already kids, but we also knew about the racially skewed nature of our society at the time, that white was right and black was to stay back. and to see this man in prison, defying, of course he was in prison for politics, he was a political prisoner, but he was defiant all the way, and all the way until he died. So that inspired me in ways, that I cannot even explain, Beggy. And I think I've been unafraid of power and authority from that time. So
in short, actually, the influence comes from there. I actually said Kosovo, I should have said East Timor.
And Afghanistan. I was in Afghanistan.
I think Kosovo, I was thinking of the late Lizwe.
Yes. Wang Lizwe is the one who was in Kosovo.
Yeah. But anyway, you have also done a lot of interviews and talks on Gukurahundi, which is also the subject of your PhD. And by the way, congratulations for completing.
Yes.
Dr. Malunga. So what's next for SIPO? I mean, we have really scratched the surface. We'll probably have to find another time to dig deeper into issues of Gukurahundi, which are very, very close to your heart. I know that. Secondly, your publications have been phenomenal around the issue of Gukurahundi. And I think we're looking forward to hearing even more after this. But also, there's been other things that have spoken to who you are, but also challenged you at the core. For example, you recently went through a court case that had to do with the state taking over your farm with your colleagues. So those are some of the issues that we don't have time to get into. I mean, they are referenced elsewhere. But what's next for SIPO?
To be honest, I don't know.
Yeah.
I wish I did. I'm at a point in my life where I just don't know what's next, and it's a good place. I know that always somebody has a plan, that I'm going to do this, but I've reached a point where I really just don't know what's next. I'm enjoying the place that I'm at. I'm happy I've just completed my PhD. And there's a part of me that wants to push that work forward. The scholarship around the genocide in Matabeleland and many other genocides in Africa needs to be strengthened. There's so much that needs to be documented and recorded, because the genocides don't end. See what's just happened in Ethiopia. See what's happening in Mozambique. So, and a lot of the writings and a lot of the scholarship is by Western scholars. We need more Africans writing about genocides. We need more Africans writing about our own issues from our own perspectives. So I'm contemplating if somebody will take me doing a postdoc. I don't know who will have that courage. I am obviously contemplating encouraging more scholarship on some of these issues. And then, of course, I intend to continue working on the issues I care about: social justice, human rights, democracy in our continent, in my own country, in this country, in South Africa. And of course, advancing our Pan-African ideals remains a core to my heart. Thank you. That's really, I don't know what the future has in store.
It's a good point and way to end the conversation. Clearly, we have not covered a lot of stuff that ordinarily we could. I mean, it's not possible to compress everything that we have done into 45 minutes.
Yes.
You are already in the 5th floor, so there's a lot of experiences that we could go through. So thank you so much, Sipho, for making the time. And I must also, maybe end by thanking OSISA for that matter, for having supported some of our programming. One of our innovative programs around Kisima Giving was a product of the support that we got from OSISA. And that has also led into a publication of a book that analyzed the impact of COVID on civil society, philanthropy, and the business sector. And the book was actually published this year in March. We look forward to launching it with your team and others. So thank you very much. And I'm hoping that we might find some time, maybe after a few years, to also then come back and look at what you have managed to do at the helm of the Open Society Foundation Africa now, looking at the continental work. So thank you so much, Sipho.
Thank you, Begi. Thank you so much.
Yes, that was Siphosami Malunga, the current Programs Director at Open Society Foundations Africa. And as you heard, he has had an illustrious career working on human rights, social justice, and now working on issues to do with democracy and philanthropy. Thank you for watching. See you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.